Happy Thoughtful Thursday, Ocean Room. Okay, this is your read aloud video for this week. Let me explain what you'll be taking the test on today. You will be taking a comprehension assessment on connect across the text. Your I can statement is, I can connect information I learned across a text. What? When readers connect across the text, they remember what happened earlier in the text. Remember how I said that earlier in the text to help them understand what they are reading now. Now, how? You have to ask yourself, is there anything that I've learned earlier in the text that can help me understand what I am reading now? And why good readers need to know this skill? Why? Good readers connect across the text to help them understand the whole text. Okay, so we're talking about biographies. So last week we talked about Thurgood Marshall. Earlier this week we talked about Alvin Ailey. Now we are going to talk about a young man named Richard Wright and the library card. Okay, so I hope you enjoy it. Let's begin. Richard loved the sound of words. He loved the stories his mother told about the farm where she grew up. There was a willow tree by a bend in the river, she explained. I dreamed all my girl dreams down there. Richard loved to hear his grandfather tell about the war, how he ran away from his master and fought the rebel army. I was only a boy, his grandfather said proudly, but I fought as well as any man. I fought in the rain and in the mud. I carried the flag at the head of the troops. Richard longed to read stories on his own, but his family was very poor. They moved often, looking for work in different towns and cities. His father cleaned office buildings. His mother cooked in kitchens of wealthy white people. Richard had little chance to go to school. His mother taught him when she could, reading the funny papers out loud, sounding each word carefully. When Richard finally learned to read, he couldn't buy or borrow the books he wanted so badly. Books were expensive. The doors of the library were shut against him because he was black. So Richard read whatever he could find. Old newspapers, books without covers pulled from ash cans. When Richard was 17, he caught a bus to Memphis. He hoped to find work, earn enough money to move to Chicago, where he would make a new life for himself in the North. Richard walked the hot streets looking for a job that would be his ticket to freedom. He saw many young men like himself searching for the same job, the same way out. He finally found a place in an optician's office. He polished eyeglasses, swept the floors, and ran errands for the white men. As long as he kept his head down, as long as he began every sentence with "sir," Richard was safe. At night, Richard returned to the boarding house where he had rented a room. To save money, he ate beans from the can, warmed by water from the tap. Listening to the noise of the street below his window, Richard felt a familiar hunger for words. There were thousands of books in the public library, but only white people could get a card, could take them out. But Richard had an idea. At work, he looked around the office trying to find one man who might understand his hunger for books. For the most part, they were like so many white men he had known before. They would never understand a black boy who wanted a library card, a black boy who wanted to read books even when they didn't read. Only one man seemed different from the others. Jim Falk kept to himself, and the other men ignored him as they ignored Richard. Several times, Richard had been sent to the library to check out books for him. One day, when the other men were out to lunch and Jim was eating alone at his desk, Richard approached him. I need your help, Richard said. Are you in some kind of trouble? Jim asked with a suspicious look. I want to read books. I want to use the library, but I can't get a card, Richard said, hoping Jim would not laugh in his face. What do you want to read? Jim asked cautiously. Novels, plays, history. Richard felt confused. His mind was racing so fast. He couldn't think of a single book. Jim said nothing, but reached into his desk and brought up a worn white card. He handed it to Richard. How will you use it? Jim asked. I'll write a note, Richard said, like the ones you wrote when I get books for you. All right, Jim said nervously. Don't tell anyone else. I don't want to get into any trouble, you hear? No, sir, Richard promised. I'll be careful. So I'm going to stop right here. And I want you to think about this. So right now, Jim, thinking about it now, okay? Right now, Jim is very nervous about helping Richard, okay? In a time where black people were not allowed to read, okay? This lets me know that if Jim was willing to give Richard his card, he must really know how serious he is about his love for reading. I'm going to show you something, okay? This was a picture of Richard Wright, okay? And right here was a picture of a library card back then. Let's continue on in the story. After work, Richard walked through the crowded streets to the library. He felt as if he were on a train to Chicago, as if he were traveling north already. But when Richard walked through the door, he felt the old fear again. Many heads were raised at the sight of a black boy in the library. Richard kept his eyes down, not looking up until he stood before the checkout desk. The librarian put on her glasses to make sure she wasn't seeing things. Richard handed her the note he had written and stepped back. Why can't Mr. Falk get his own books? She asked sharply. He's very busy, Richard replied, his legs trembling. All right, the woman said, but you tell Mr. Falk I'd rather see him in person next time, you hear? Richard roamed the stacks, unable to believe there was this many books in the world. He touched the leather spines and fingered the pages he had dreamed about for such a long time. So I'm going to stop right here, okay? Now, I'm going to connect across the text, okay? Now, the text states he was in awe, and he couldn't believe how many books there were. So this lets me know. Earlier, we read about Richard. We read how, he wanted to get books when he was younger, but they were too expensive. And then, he wanted to go to school, but he couldn't go to school because back then, they were poor. He couldn't go to school because it was segregated. And so his mom tried to teach him as much as she can. And then he couldn't go to the library because the library was only for white people at the time. Blacks couldn't go. So now, fast forward, he is going for himself with Mr. Jim's card, and he gets in the library and he is amazed. He is amazed of the world of books that he sees that are at his fingertips, right? All right, let's continue on in the story. Are you sure these books aren't for you? The librarian asked in a loud voice when he went to check them out. Once again, heads turned, and Richard felt the eyes of white people on him. He thought he had been caught, that he would never be able to read the books he wanted so badly. But Richard told the lady what she wanted to hear, what she believed was true about all black boys like him. No, ma'am, he said. These books aren't for me. Heck, I can't even read. The librarian laughed out loud and stamped his books. Richard heard other people laugh as he walked out the door. Now, let me pause right here, Ocean Room. Now, you know, okay? You know how I feel about reading. Readers are leaders. I don't care what color you are. But for the purpose of this book, what did you learn earlier as a good reader that can help you understand why Richard told the librarian he couldn't read? Why do you think that? Take a moment. As we read earlier in the story, I already explained to you what kind of time this was. This was a time where libraries were only for white people. Blacks were not allowed in the library, let alone caught reading. You could have got in trouble, a lot of trouble for that. So what did he do? Being a smart individual as he was, Richard was real smart. Richard told that librarian, he said, no, ma'am, I don't know how to read, because that's what you think. But we all know he knows how to read, right, Ocean Room? Let's continue in the story. That night in his room, Richard read until the sun dimmed the electric light. He read the words of Dickens, Tolstoy, and Stephen Crane. He read about people who had suffered as he had, even though their skin was white. They longed for the same freedom Richard had spent his life trying to find. With the light of the sun coming through the window, Richard put down the book. He felt sleepy, but the words he had read echoed in his ears, colored everything he saw. He wondered if he would act differently, if others would see how the books had changed him. Richard knew he would never be the same again. That morning, he carried his book to work in a newspaper. Whenever he had a chance, whenever the office was empty, for a moment he read. Mr. Falk walked over, pretending that he was asking Richard to go and pick up his laundry for him. What you get? He asked under his breath. Richard opened the newspaper and showed him. Jim seemed shocked at first, but then a smile came over his face. Those are powerful books, Richard, he said. Those books will stay with you for the rest of your life. But for now, he said, looking around the office, you should keep them to yourself. Richard tried to do just that, but as the time for the journey north came closer, he didn't care who saw him reading. The men in the office either laughed at him or asked him if he was crazy. What's a colored boy like you toting a bag full of books around for? Your head can't hold all them big words. Every now and then, Jim smiled at him with across the room. The library books had changed some of Richard's feelings about white people. Richard still feared them, but he understood them better. The day he left for Chicago, Richard stopped by Mr. Falk's desk. Thank you, Richard said. Thank you for the books. Thank you for everything. Jim didn't say a word, but he shook Richard's hand in front of everybody. So I'm going to stop right here because this is very powerful. Ocean Room babies. And I don't think you understand how powerful it was for a white man to be shaking a black man's hand in front of a job or any place for that matter back then. Why did Richard thank Jim? Okay, so listen, we have to go back, okay, because right now we're about to connect. We're about to connect the text. So when he first got there, you have to remember when Richard first got to Memphis, he was trying to find a job. He found a job, right? Working for white men. And then in the place where he worked, he was trying to look around because he's like, man, I gotta find somebody who can help me with this love, with this urge that I have for reading. And he finally found Mr. Jim. And not just that, he was able to trust Jim. Jim understood, even though they both, their lives was at risk, even though they both could have got in trouble, even though this was so dangerous during this time, Jim still felt the love that this young man had for reading. And instead of not helping him, he helped him by giving him his library card and expanding his knowledge for words and the things that are going on in the world. On the train going north, flying across the open fields, Richard remembered the books he had read. The words came back to him, the stories more real than the train itself. Every page was a ticket to freedom, to the place where he would always be free. The end. Ocean Room, I really hope that you enjoyed this story today. What is the main idea of this text? I want you to think about it, because you know the main idea is what the story is mostly about. And being a good reader, you should always understand what the story is mostly about when you are connecting the text, right? We're trying to link the text from what you read earlier to what you've read now at this point. And at this point, we have learned about a man named Richard Wright, who loved to read despite being African American, despite not being able to go to a library, despite not being able to go and find a book and be caught reading a book. He did all those things despite all of that, okay? And then, not just that, but he had so much courage and he was so brave, because nobody just randomly goes to another person outside your race during those times, because it was during segregation. And he was so brave, and thank God that Jim had the heart to understand where he was coming from, because it was beyond his color. Right now, I would like for you all to click on the Google Doc that is underneath this and complete your exit slip. Remember our biographies, because they're really good. All right, talk to you later. Bye.